This is the PTI Consulting Podcast, hosted by Michelle Owen.
Hello and welcome along to the latest PTI Consulting Podcast, hosted by myself, Michelle Owen from Sky Sports. Today we're talking about the growth of the NFL and the differences between the Premier League and the NFL. Obviously, the whole NFL area has certainly blown up. It's become very popular again in the last 5 years or so in the UK. Recently, PTI Consulting hosted the Stadium Technology Insights event, and most of the attendees listed the NFL as the leading light in creating fan engagement. So we wanted to get some industry insider insight into this, into the strategies that an NFL team adopt, and then maybe draw a comparison to working at a Premier League club. So joining us today is Scott McCubbin. Scott, tell us more about what you do. You were from the Jacksonville Jags. Tell me about your role there.
Yeah, hey Michelle. So I've been working for the Jaguars now for 2.5 years here in the UK, based out of the NFL International Office in London. Predominantly focused on sponsorship, brand partnerships, and generally commercialising the presence that we have established here over the course of the last 6 or 7 years.
Fantastic. And we've also got Richard Lamb with us. Richard is a NAD with PTI, but Richard, you're also Manchester United commercial manager in Asia, in the APAC region. You've got a very interesting background, so we'll be talking to you. Welcome along, Richard. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Michelle. Nice to speak to you.
And also joining the three of us on the podcast is Nathan Bethell, the Marketing Director of PTI Consulting. So, Scott, you're based in the UK then. So how does that work with your role and what does it cover?
So I guess for a little bit of sort of further background for those who aren't aware, obviously the NFL in the current international format have been playing games in London since 2007. And back in 2012, when the games were proving very popular, the NFL had moved from one game in London to 2 games, the commissioner effectively asked all 32 owners if anyone was interested in moving one of their regular season home fixtures to London on a regular basis. And for a number of different reasons, and being the international businessman that he is, our owner Shahid Khan said he'd be interested in that. And so since 2013, we've been playing 7 home games in Jacksonville and 1 home game in London. I guess the added benefit of sort of the opening up of the London market and the annual game that we have here is that we effectively benefit from an exclusive marketing and commercial position from an NFL franchise perspective here. So we are, in essence, the only NFL team of the 32 that can independently run our own events, create our own content, and I guess importantly sign commercial partnerships here out of the UK. So that's what I was brought in to do.
And from a commercial opportunity sort of perspective, you've seen both sides, I guess. You've got Premier League experience. So what are the main differences, if you could just outline a few of them, between an NFL team and a Premier League team from a commercial opportunity sort of perspective?
I mean, there's loads, so we probably don't have time to go through them all. But if I was to attempt to narrow it down, I think strictly from a partnership sales perspective anyway, the biggest difference is in the NFL, primarily anyway, when you're talking about your team assets or the assets that you're including into a partnership deal, you're not really selling the same global media platform that you're selling in the Premier League. We're all familiar in this market with perimeter LED advertising, and if we're honest with ourselves, the fact that in a lot of deals drives a significant amount of the value in Premier League partnerships. The NFL doesn't have that. If you watch an NFL broadcast carefully, you'll see that there really isn't much. There's no perimeter advertising for a start, and there really aren't that many broadcast visible in-game assets, which is intentional because they drive such huge TV advertising revenues, and that then therefore drives the broadcast deals. They're keen to protect that. So I think the flow or the knock-on effect of that is we have to be a bit more creative in terms of the assets we create, the activations that we run, to make sure that we can drive similar sort of values without that sort of big individual team media play, I guess. That would be one thing. And then, I guess ultimately we are a franchise at the end of the day. So we are in essence licensing our intellectual property, our business from the NFL. And that comes with a few sort of slightly tighter regulations and rules about what we can and can't do in commercialising our own assets. You didn't really have that in the Premier League. It was down to largely the discretion of each individual owner as to how and for what value and with what assets they wanted to commercialise the business. So those would certainly be two. And I suppose, from a geographical perspective, the NFL is global, and it's certainly, moving increasingly towards becoming a global proposition. The brand obviously well known, but, still a heavily sort of skewed focus domestically in the US, whereas if you were to compare it to the Premier League from a genuinely global perspective, I think you'd say that the Premier League probably still holds a much sort of tighter global proposition, and that impacts on which brands you talk to in which territories, and the kind of companies that you're speaking to about this proposition. So those would be a few of the main things that I'd identify.
With the Jags being quite consistent over here in the UK, has that been able to grow the fan base here locally, and has that seen a real growth of the kind of the partners that you can attract here?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a nice position as a commercial sales guy when you're the only guy selling something in the market. So that's been great for us. If you're a brand and you're interested in the NFL in the UK, you've effectively got 2 points of entry. One is at a league level with the NFL, and one is with the Jaguars. So that's a pretty cool spot for us to be in. From a sort of going back to the first question on the popularity, I mean, at the end of the 2018 season, the NFL ran a survey with SMG and identified 15.3 million NFL fans now in the UK, which is a pretty big number. I think was about 7% year on year from what they'd established in 2017. So it's a big proposition. And from a Jaguars perspective, when we came here in 2013 for our first game, we were 32nd most popular out of 32 in terms of merchandise sales in the UK, which is not a great story, but it means the only way is up, which is positive. Fast forward to the end of the 2018 season, the Jaguars were the fourth most popular team in the UK as measured by merchandise sales. So I think that's a pretty good proof point for both the size of the NFL sort of fan base here in the UK generally, but also the progression that the Jaguars have made as a result of that consistent presence and really providing fans in the UK with, consistent NFL content and messaging.
Yeah, you've got shared ownership, haven't you, between the Jags and Fulham? Has that been rewarding commercially, if at all?
Yeah, so we have a couple of partners who promote and market their business through both properties. The most obvious example, the most recent one being Western Union, who have a partnership at Fulham, also have a partnership with the Jags. And it makes sense for them because, we're working very closely with them on some of our foreign exchange business. We clearly have the need for that, given the international nature of our activity. And they have both an interest in football, obviously. They've got partnerships with Liverpool and or others, but obviously a huge presence in the US as well. So there is that cross-promotion, and we do look for those opportunities where they exist. I guess on the flip side of that, we're very conscious not to force, and I'm going to say it, so apologies, guys, soccer content down people's throats when we're talking to them about the NFL. And we're very conscious not to, vice versa, stuff NFL content down people's throats when actually they might be more interested in football. So, it's just finding a balance between making sure you're leveraging all of the assets in the portfolio, which obviously our owner is keen for us to do, but making sure you're doing it in a relevant and a targeted way, because the two propositions are very different. We're talking about one of the oldest, most traditional, most historic football clubs in the UK, with very different assets going back to the media piece that I spoke about earlier than what we're offering at the Jags. One of the reasons I think we've been successful here over the last couple of years commercially is we're offering something new, something fresh, something different. And I think you just have to be careful that, with the introduction of the football conversation, you don't start confusing that message.
I was just going to say to Richard, obviously Richard's had great experience taking a brand into the new territory. What was that like in terms of growing kind of Manchester United?
It was a dream, really, because Manchester United is such a well-established brand all around the world that you didn't, when you did the cold calls, you didn't have to introduce yourself. You just say the word Manchester United and they respond, what time do you want to meet? So the great thing working at a club the size of Manchester United is people are very aware of the club. I remember sometimes I'd attend conferences or meet people and swap business cards, and they'd say, I'm sorry, I'm not a football fan. And my response was always, do you know David Beckham? Yeah. Do you know what colour Manchester United jerseys are? Red. Do you know what the home ground is? Old Trafford. And so I'd say, well, you're not a football fan, but you know everything about us. And that just shows you the strength of the brand, really. So in that sense, it was a dream, really, being able to work for Manchester United in Asia because it's so well known. On the flip side, it is a premium brand and, there are challenges as well.
And GDPR has been a really prominent thing in the headlines recently, Scott. There's been hefty fines for British Airways, Marriott Hotels, both prominent sponsors in sport. So how do you tackle that issue?
Yeah, it's been an interesting one because, similar sort of GDPR concerns do not exist in the United States of America, which you guys will probably know. So it was a bit of an education for our legal team, to be honest, in wrapping their head around how that needed to be managed over here in the UK. Luckily, given where we sit and, as part of the NFL International Office, we had a lot of support from those guys and walked kind of hand in hand with them through the process. And ultimately, again, going back to the sort of franchisee question, the NFL actually hold a lot of the franchise data that we access centrally anyway. So again, we were fortunate that we could take our lead from the NFL and almost just fall under their umbrella and mirror their policy, which was really, and it's frustrating to say out loud, but was really just to start again and making sure that we were compliant with everything that we needed to be. The NFL is a highly commercial, at times, quite aggressive organisation, but they're also very conservative and image conscious. So, anything that would have the potential for contravening any rules is not something they tend to entertain. So, we've been pretty watertight on that. And as I said, it was a little bit frustrating starting again, almost from a sort of database and data capture perspective, but pretty quickly we've got back up to speed. We've had a 12-month period now, pretty much, since we had to enact those changes. And when you've got 4 games, as there is in 2019, all selling out the best part of, whether it's at Wembley or at Tottenham, 70 to 90,000 tickets, you can recapture a lot of that data pretty quickly. And our partners have understood that. Going back to your examples of British Airways and Marriott's, our partners have been equally conscious about those regulations. So, again, whilst it was a tricky conversation to have with them to explain that our database had been reset to zero and we were having to go through that process, of course I understood it and, had the same concerns as we had.
You touched on being image conscious there for an NFL team. I wonder what surprised you most about the way an NFL team does things, I suppose, off the pitch as opposed to what Premier League teams do.
Good question. I mean, speaking specifically from a Jacksonville point of view, and again, I'm not sure how familiar you guys are, but Jacksonville's a pretty small market. We're the second smallest market in the NFL behind Green Bay. And Green Bay is a slight anomaly because it's one of the founding franchises and it's in Wisconsin and they've got a huge catchment area. And it's actually one of the reasons that Shard embarked on this London initiative was it opens up a huge new market when actually the market we're located in domestically is quite small. The reason I mention that is it means that our partnerships team have to be pretty creative in terms of, the assets they create, the opportunities they provide. So again, I don't know how much you guys have seen, but you might know that the Jaguars' home stadium, TIA Bank Field, has 2 swimming pools located in the stadium, for instance, where partners and corporate hospitality clients, instead of buying a box like we might be slightly more familiar with in the UK, can buy a cabana and access to the pool to watch the game. That's one example of
That's good.
being slightly more creative and, giving people to a reason to come and support the TBS, but enjoy themselves equally. Because let's not forget, the game can take anywhere between 3 hours to 3 hours and 10 minutes, given the timeout stoppages, the TV ad breaks. So, as a franchise, you need to work pretty hard to give people other things to do and to engage with throughout the course of the game. And again, without wanting to blow our own trumpet too much, the Jaguars were actually voted the number one fan experience in the NFL last year, and have been on a number of occasions for the last 5 years, for reasons such as that I just mentioned. So certainly one thing that comes to mind where there is a big difference with the kind of things that NFL teams are doing versus necessarily what Premier League teams are doing. But that's partially because of the length of the game and partially because of fan behaviour.
Yeah, wow. Imagine watching Arsenal on a rainy Tuesday night in a cabana. That'd be an experience, wouldn't it?
Yeah, I mean, we're fortunate in Jacksonville that the climate allows us. I'm not sure it would work exactly the same here.
Yeah, that's amazing. In terms of infrastructure then, it sounds like it's a huge operation, both in people and technology. Is it comparable between one of the top flight teams here in the Premier League and over in the US?
I would say the US are a bit further advanced than we are here in the Premier League, to be honest, from a technological perspective. We're doing some good work over in Jacksonville with a group called Tech Mahindra, looking at all of our fan applications, our internal networking and connectivity, which, to be honest, is still something I think people are trying to solve for in sport. And we've been talking about Wi-Fi and data and connectivity for years and years and years. And it's still actually the pretty basic part that a lot of people get wrong. And, without wanting to sort of evangelise about another NFL franchise too much, but I've got to give them their kudos. My boss and I went to US Bank Stadium up in Minnesota last year, which is where the Vikings play. And they have it's a brand new stadium. They've got a brand new sort of infrastructure capability that is a mix of Wi-Fi and data agnostic solutions. It's provided by Verizon, but it allows the other networks to play on the solution. It was unbelievable from a connectivity perspective. Tens of thousands of users at any one time, and download speeds, watching videos, accessing social media, not a problem. And in that sense, the same is true of Mercedes-Benz new stadium in Atlanta, which you guys are probably all familiar with. The NFL, in my opinion, anyway, and not just the NFL, probably US sports more generally, the NBA doing some pretty cool stuff on court from an analytics perspective. We're probably slightly further ahead from where we are. I don't know if you'd agree, Richard. We had similar sort of challenges at West Ham. We did some good work, but there was certainly strides to be made on that.
No, I do. I think there's some really exciting things going on in esports as well, which traditional sports can learn a lot from. I know that esports, some of the companies there are working a lot with virtual technology. Obviously their players and their fans are from all different parts of the world, and they're able to connect within this virtual space. So I think there's certainly a lot that the traditional sports can learn from esports.
What about predictions then, Scott? What are you thinking for the upcoming NFL season? How are the Jags going to do? The off-season's been interesting, hasn't it? Yeah,
I mean, we made a big move, the biggest move being at the quarterback position. We signed Nick Foles, who, for those of you who don't know, has been around the league for a long time. He won a Super Bowl back in 2017 with the Philadelphia Eagles. So he's got great NFL pedigree. And hopefully will bring a new sort of dynamic to the team. The noises coming out of training camp have been pretty good. We've had our first couple of preseason games, which from a results perspective haven't necessarily gone according to plan. But I mean, even more so than the Premier League, it is tough to read too much into those because, and I'm not revealing any trade secrets here, this has been very public, but I mean, we sat 32 players in the first game against the Ravens, and we sat 29 last night against the Eagles. They didn't even dress, including Nick Foles, Leonard Fournette, Jalen Ramsey, Calais Campbell, all of the guys who will likely start when the season rolls around. So from that perspective, if there are any Jags fans listening, I wouldn't get too hung up on the results we've seen over the last couple of weeks. But Yeah, I think we're in good shape. The Jags, when we had a bit of a breakout year in 2017, we went to the AFC Championship game. We were 6 minutes away from beating the Patriots, and unfortunately, the curse of Bill Belichick and Tom Brady hit the Jags that time, as it has hit many people. But the strength of that season was really built around the defense. We've got some awesome players on that side of the ball, including the likes of Jalen Ramsey, who's, if not the best, certainly one of the best cornerbacks in the NFL. Calais Campbell, Yannick Ngakoue. So I think we're in good shape.
We've seen quite a few British players who've kind of taking places now on teams. Is that something that the Jags are look at down the line?
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, as my commercial role in the UK does not extend to scouting and player decision making as much as I would like it to. But look, the NFL, they have a very formal now international player pathway program where they're constantly looking for new talent within Europe, crossover talent coming from other sports. You guys have probably seen the Christian Wade story. I think it was his first touch of the ball in the NFL. He ran for a 65-yard touchdown. There's F.A. Obada at the Panthers, who is an unbelievable story. Originally from Nigeria, moved to Holland, and then ended up coming to London, I think, at the age of 14 or 15. And he's been very open about this, got into the wrong crowds. Life wasn't going the way he expected it to go, and he turned to American football. Joined a team called the London Warriors, which is one of the better amateur teams here in the UK, and now finds himself on the starting roster for the Carolina Panthers, which is pretty awesome. So I think those stories like that generally for the game here are pretty awesome. I would love the Jags to take one of those British guys at some point, but we'll have to see. All 32 teams get a look at these guys. That's how the pathway program works. So we're competing with a lot of other guys who are also interested in this up and coming talent. But it's great to see.
Yeah, we saw a European NFL back in the 80s, didn't we? Could that happen again, do you reckon, Scott?
This is a very personal opinion, but I doubt it, to be honest. It was an interesting experiment. And it was obviously coming off the back of the popularity of the NFL in the late 80s and the early 90s on Channel 4 and Dan Marino and the Miami Dolphins in that era that some of us may remember, maybe not the younger listeners. But starting a new league is a big lift. It's pretty resource intensive. And actually, I think part of the reason that the NFL does well here is, as much a cultural lifestyle play as it is a strictly sporting one. And I think that whole Americana entertainment spectacle is something that interests people. And I'm not quite sure that a European equivalent quite cuts the mustard. And to be honest, the NFL found a great formula here now. The 4 games in London this year, as I mentioned, are sold out. I think tickets to the Jaguars Texans game at Wembley sold out in 28 minutes. So, it's probably the old adage of, if it isn't broken, don't fix it type thing. But there will be other opportunities. The NFL is huge in markets like Germany now and France and a couple of the other European markets. And I'm sure at some point in the near future, they'll be looking further afield into territories that Richard is more familiar with over in the East. Watch this space, I guess.
Tottenham obviously invested in an NFL pitch, which is under the main football surface. Obviously highlights how valuable the NFL games are to a UK audience. Do you think there's any limits of taking games on the road? And is there, I guess, a pushback from people in the US who don't want to dilute their games to other countries?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I'm sure every individual's got their own perspective on it. I mean, there are limits in terms of the schedule. It's not an easy thing to get right when you're scheduling the NFL fixture list to account for international games. But again, they found a good way of doing that. I think with the games, once the games are complete this year, 31 out of the 32 teams will have travelled and played in London. The only ones that haven't are the Green Bay Packers. So, that's a pretty good sign that with the right formula and the right preparation, teams are willing to come here. And, from a Jaguars perspective, we found a great formula in playing one game in London every year. And actually, whilst there was probably some raised eyebrows in the initial stages over in Jacksonville when they were losing a home game, I think the fans in Jacksonville see it as a huge positive now because the increased revenue that we generate from this game all goes back into making the franchise better in Jacksonville, which is good for everyone. And to be honest, secondly, and the mayor of Jacksonville has been very public in saying this, every time Jacksonville is mentioned in the same sentence as a global powerhouse city like London, that is a good thing for Jacksonville. So, look, we'll see. The 4-game formula certainly works well here for now. And, time will tell.
Absolutely. It's so interesting to hear your thoughts on the NFL over here, Scott. And Richard, hearing you talk about, the things that have affected you when you're with Manchester United, how everyone instantly recognised them. I wonder if it's going to be a matter of time, do you think, Scott, until people in the UK recognise the Jags as an NFL team? They look at a jersey and they'd know what it was? Yeah,
I think so. I mean, we're getting there, going back to the sort of rise from 32nd most popular to 4th most popular. That is surely a sign that people are beginning to recognise us. And, like I said, watch this space. Perhaps there are some other things coming down the line in the next couple of years that, of course, I can't speak of, but that will make the Jags even more recognisable here. But, we're really enjoying it. We're delighted that London London and the UK has almost adopted Jags as their home team, if you like. And we're very keen to continue to grow our presence here and keep bringing more and more NFL and Jaguars content to fans over here in the UK.
Fantastic. Well, Scott, Richard, thank you both for your time. Really interesting to get that insight. And that's the latest from PTI Consulting on this podcast. Listen out again for another one soon.
Thanks for listening to the PTI Consulting podcast. Find out more about us at pticonsulting.co.uk.